Remember the desserts your grandma made when Christmas was near? Before store-bought cakes and delivery took over, Christmas tables were stacked with treats most of us have forgotten. So let's talk about 25 desserts our grandmothers always prepared during the holiday season. Tipsy Parsons is something that really is known for the waves it made in the 18th and 19th centuries. You have layers and layers of this nice, thick sponge cake, or occasionally pound cake, which gets drenched in all the sherry and bourbon it can soak up. Inside, there's a lovely custard filling that's to die for, making full use of all the best in-season fruits. It was something that got very popular in the antebellum South, since back then, using alcohol in food was something that was only reserved for those with big wallets. I guess it was something in the South Carolina or Georgia air back then that made people crave boozy food. These kinds of influences in cooking were common for the South, where honestly most of their food was known for its African and European influences. Plus, the fruits they would use for Tipsy Parsons were always in season in the South, so it became a regional specialty for them too. The name suits the dish though. It uses an incredible amount of alcohol to get the job done, and you definitely could get tipsy off of it. It never really tasted anything like brandy or whiskey though. I mean, if you really tried, you could get some faint notes, but it would be hidden under a lot of blackberries or strawberries, with biscuits squashed in the middle and a pretty heavy base. Speaking of more boozy food, did you ever wonder where the tradition of Jello Shots started from? Well, by the 1990s, everyone was getting drunk off of alcoholic gelatin, and people even started having themed Jello Shots for different parties. For example, Christmas parties would have candy cane Jello Shots, dressed up like the iconic candy canes you'd always associate with Christmas. Around the start of the 2000s, people actually started experimenting a lot with what they could do with Jello Shots. They used different colored ones and associated flavors with themes, which worked because they really were trying to create Jello Shots that looked and tasted great. It really took off in the late 2000s all over the nation, so there isn't a specific state where Jello Shots were more or less loved. However, there is a certain phase of life with which you commonly associate Jello Shots. There's been many stories of otherwise tame people having one too many Jello Shots at a college party or bar and ending up with memorable incidents. Maybe that's what the supposed inventor Tom Lehrer intended anyway. It seems singers back then were even more known for partying than they are today, because apparently Tom would serve these up at his, and that's how he spread the idea. Most people thought they were a much more refreshing way to have shots, and that's probably what helped them keep their momentum well into the 2000s too. That's all for partying in well-off times though, but if you go a little bit towards the past, namely the post-World War II era, you'll find that practical dishes like no-bake eggnog icebox cakes were a lot more popular. So, in case you don't know, they used to have ice boxes to keep things cold before refrigeration, as we know it became a thing. In the post-war era, there were still a lot of people who lived by rationing and making the best use of everything. Habits in wartime are hard to get rid of, right? These cakes became really popular because they used eggnog and were a convenience dessert. Plus, the tradition of icebox cakes was something that had been made really accessible to maintain. Thanks to companies like Nabisco, which continued to make their chocolate wafer cookies and popularized icebox cake recipes with those at the core, it just meant that everything you needed for it, you could buy. It was also a sign of how Americans would go towards food that was ready-made more than food that needed to be cooked from scratch. While it may not have the same attention to detail, it gets the job done pretty well since sometimes you just need good food that hits the spot. It doesn't have to be perfectly presented or made. These recipes came pretty close though. Back to the dawn of the 2000s, which brought a lot of new stuff with it using unfamiliar and familiar concepts. One of those was profiterole, whiskey, and maple trifles. Profiteroles themselves were just these cream-filled pastry puffs, which caught on within America when the country started to deeply explore French cuisine. They were one of the first kinds of choux pastries that you could find, which is the same kind of pastry they used to make eclairs and cream puffs. It was really common to see profiteroles in New Orleans, where the first French immigrants and settlers had made communities and waved their recipes into the culture of American eating. Those recipes never called for using trifles, though. which to some was sort of seen as an affront to tradition, but to most it was seen as a very fun way to get a trifle-based dish as a reliable option for a Saturday night dinner. This dessert had a lot of elegance to it, which made it perfect for outings with meaning or any kind of celebration. This maple version used whiskey and maple syrup, which gave it a very nostalgic flavor you definitely associate with American eating. It got really popular in Midwestern and Southern restaurants in the 2000s, and the dessert was amazing at working both whiskey and maple syrup into one neatly blended flavor. We're going to stay in this 1950 to 2000s period for a while, so buckle up. It's not a surprise either, since some of the most prolific dishes of the 20th century came out of this specific half of it. One of the most iconic recipes from that time was Forgotten Kisses, which were a meringue-based cookie. They got the name because the cookies would usually be left in the oven even after the time was done. If it doesn't make sense to you at first, they'd put them in for hours or overnight usually, so people would forget all about them until they were perfectly ready to eat. I guess there have been weirder names in history for food. Anyway, you're probably wondering what the point of leaving them for that long even is. After all, who doesn't like fresh cookies? People did this because it apparently made them firmer and gave them their unforgettable light and airy texture. Plus, meringue cookies stay okay even if you leave them for a really long while. These cookies were also kind of a sign of the times, because around when they were making waves in bakeries and holiday cookie exchanges, slow cookers also became a thing. It was a part of a new trend in American cooking where the masses were favoring recipes they could prep, leave, and forget about until they were ready, while still being inexpensive and easy enough to get. Hey, every family needs to eat, and sometimes doing it on a budget is ideal. So if that was you back in the 1960s or 70s, then you would often get your sugar rush satisfied with Forgotten Kisses. It was pretty inexpensive to make, and home baking was already the trend back then anyway. You're in luck if cookies are your thing. I got another solid one for you right out of the hearts of 1950 cookbooks. Cherry Winks, as you can guess, were this cookie that really highlighted how good a maraschino cherry can get. That wasn't all, though. It was one of the first cookies that used the stuff it did. The foundation for the cookies is an oatmeal cookie base after all, and that's been around way longer than either you or me. It was in the post-war period that most of the other ingredients involved with Cherry Winks started becoming something everyone everywhere in the States could afford and get. Still, this was a unique recipe, all things considered. I mean, where else will you hear about dates, cherries, and crushed cornflakes in a cookie winning a Pillsbury Bake-Off contest? Yeah, I thought so. The baking trends in the 1950s were pretty experimental, and here it shows. Plus, no one could say no to maraschino cherries anyway. Mix all that with rolled oats, brown sugar, and vanilla, plus some sweetened shredded coconut, all widely available commercial products now, and you can understand how this dish took off the way it did in a time where home baking was trending like never before. If you ever ask your grandma about this, I'm sure she can recall a Christmas or two where there were ample cherry winks to go around. I guess wafers are close enough to a cookie that this could count, but I'll leave that for you to decide. If we go over to states like South Carolina, especially in places like Charleston, then you can find some traces of Benna wafers. They were sesame seed cookies that came from the Gullah Geechee people of the Low Country, and the Benna seeds were a West African variant that were brought in because of the slave trades. The Gullah Geechee were descendants of those same slaves who had worked in plantations across South Carolina and Georgia, and a lot of their popular recipes that made use of Benny seeds would become mainstays of the cuisine in those areas. They had specific knowledge on how to grow these seeds as well as how to properly make use of them in cooking, and they were always used in sweets and desserts even then too. In their culture, it's meant to be good luck, so dishes that made use of them were for holidays more than anything else. They were given as gifts or brought on over at parties as a snack, and they had a lovely nutty flavor that gave them a lot of support at crowded parties. Later on, throughout the years, it became more common for others to use dishes like Benny wafers as Christmas desserts, especially if you were having a table that was entirely home-cooked. Not that people had that many options for buying stuff for Christmas stores back then, not like we do now. Speaking of, what do you guys usually get for Christmas food? Or do you not order or buy anything at all? Back to the Jello takeover of the 60s, we have cherry chiffon gelatin, which just sounds like something that tastes and smells like flowers. You'd be kinda right. I mean, it's definitely got a very sweet taste overall to it, and the appearance did make it look like an edible flower. It had a very light and airy texture despite how it used whipped egg whites and cream, and it became a holiday favorite at potlucks. You'd serve this with salads and other gelatin-based desserts, and believe me, it worked every time. People love it when a pretty-looking dish tastes good too, so even if there were better gelatin dishes out there taste-wise, this was the perfect thing for a party. Cherry chiffon gelatin wasn't really the kind of dish you would make for yourself at home, though. It just had a presence to it, the kind that made you recognize it as a dish for a finer table and occasion. People would save dishes like these for important days on the calendar. After all, there weren't many casual chiffon things to eat, as it was considered one of the foods of the wealthy. It wasn't until much later when commercial brands for the stuff like Knox Gelatin and Jello were founded in 1890 and 1897, making it something that people could enjoy even at their homes. While it's true that eventually gelatin-based desserts became the norm at potlucks and church dinners, it was still also true that chiffon desserts were still reserved for when you really wanted to make dinner count. The first chiffon pie was brought in by Harry Baker in the 1920s, and ever since then, chiffon-style dishes have always been considered a finer dish. One of the salads you would see with a cherry chiffon gelatin is a cranberry fluff salad. Cranberries are already something you must be pretty used to living in this country, since every Christmas boomer can never seem to let go of their classic cranberry dishes that they swear have been passed down since forever in their family. They're actually not wrong. Cranberries are one of the few things that grow natively in America after all the way from the East Coast to the central United States, which is why it's so popular. These salads were a side dish, but also a dessert, and it was getting harder to tell which was which since both genres of food started taking elements from each other thanks to dishes like this. It was at its highest popularity during the 1970s after the war period, when people had settled back into eating for fun and not for fuel. Despite how it's such a nice dish to look at and eat, it was also forgotten relatively quickly into the 2010s. Thankfully, the recent interest in reinterpreting old American dishes from the 20th century has helped it have a little bit of a revival, so who knows? Maybe we can see a full comeback. Sticking to the cranberry theme, we have something that'll really take your imagination for a run this time. Look, we all love cheese balls. You love them. I have an unhealthy obsession with them. They've always been there for us when there was only sleep for dinner. So they're a pretty personal topic. When people think about cheese balls, they think of a munch-oriented, cheese-filled heaven. So when you combine dried cranberries with sharp cheddar into the classic cheese balls, you get a controversial dish. I don't know how people loved it at parties in the Northeast, but they couldn't get enough of this there. Obviously, not everyone had the same enthusiasm for this. It took two completely opposite ends of the flavor spectrum and mixed them into cheese balls of all things. What do you think? Would you give it an honest shot? A lot of the dishes so far reflect food trends of the post-World War II era, where America was kind of revamping its identity as far as food was concerned. Orange Spritz cookies were a part of a new wave of orange craze that took over the nation. Though the fruit hadn't gotten much love outside of juice before, suddenly everyone and their grandmother were making batches of orange desserts like Spritz cookies. The reason these got pretty popular was through immigrant communities, which you can really credit a lot of food that's popular in America to. The orange zest was key here. It gave it that citrusy identity that the cookies were so known for. Recipes for these were all over Betty Crocker and Better Homes and Gardens cookbooks, and they were the joy of grandmas everywhere, especially since home-based cooking was taking off so well in the 1950s to 1970s era. Remember how we just talked about the way desserts and salads were getting cozy with each other? The lines were only getting blurrier as the years kept on coming and didn't stop, and orange gelatin pretzel salads proved that point while also being another example of the orange movement that was sweeping up home cooking. This dessert salad had its heyday in the 1980s, particularly in the Midwest, and the key to it was the pretzel crust and orange gelatin. These salads were really easy to prepare, which kept in line with the trends that the nation was heading to. The Joys of Jello was a community cookbook that featured the dish in the 1970s because it was really popular in most posh neighborhoods. Tiramisu is a bit of a weird thing. There's never been an overwhelming love for it in the 20th century, but there's been a swarm of tiramisu lovers in the late 2000s, especially thanks to the internet, because it's a dish that really shows off your cooking skills. It's an Italian dish that came in the 1980s and 1990s, and one version of it, Tiramisu Yule log cake, got really popular as a part of holiday baking. By now, America was moving pretty far away from dishes like this, though. The emphasis in the post-World War II era was on things like convenience food, thanks to a rise in TV culture. People were also really focusing on experimental dishes that combined foreign influences with American classics. That can kind of explain the birth of the Tiramisu Yule log cake, since the Yule log cake itself is a European classic. Cookbooks that really focused on holiday cooking, like Martha Stewart's Christmas or Test Kitchen's Holiday Baking, featured this version of the dish, which made a lot of use of creamy mascarpone and coffee. Christmas jelly slices were something that were short-lived but thoroughly enjoyed. They started off in the 50s as a part of all the Jello promotional cookbooks you'd see at the time. You didn't think Jello just became an overnight or organic success, did you? While people really did, it didn't take over the taste buds of the country on its own. All kinds of dishes were shoved in cookbooks to show all the things you could do with jelly, and the Christmas jelly slice was one of them. As the name suggests, it got attached to Christmas for the colors it had, red, green, and white, as well as for having a custard filling that really did well with other Christmas menus. Towards the tail end of the 20th century, holiday baking in general had taken off in an entirely new direction because people had a lot more to work with since the makeup of cooking and food in America was actively changing. An example is truffles, which are typically a pretty European dish that didn't ever have as much traction as they did in the 1980s-2000s period. People started making stuff like white Christmas truffles, which used white chocolate and mixed it with dried fruit to give a new twist on the dish. It was even popular for the grandmas of today, since the Sweet Book of Candy Making, a do-it-yourself gift-giving book, featured the dish. All kinds of gourmet candy cookbooks would give it love, too, since this was a really warm, fuzzy dish that made great use of white chocolate and fruit. Everyone loves a bit of Mars, right? It's one of the best chocolate bars we've ever had. I mean, it definitely beats Toblerone for me, but that's a video for another day. Another reason people really love the bar, besides its obvious elite taste, is that it could be worked into dishes like Mars Bar Christmas crackles pretty easily. You could do a lot of DIY stuff with a few bars of Mars and end up with a pretty solid dessert to show off your ingenuity with. Mars bars were already a favorite in America, so when people took Rice Krispies and melted Mars to make a no-bake Christmas dessert in 1990, it really took off. It was a big part of holiday party menus, and none of them felt complete without it in that time period. It was also found in no-bake sections of cookbooks, and the ones that focused a lot on party food always made a mention of it for Christmas-themed events. You already know grandmas have no chill around the Christmas season, and honestly, they're a lot more liable to just go all out with every ingredient they have rather than take it easy. It becomes a point of pride for some of them, I think, and I can kind of see why. It meant better and newer dishes for us to eat, though. I'm sure all of you can remember the cheesecake craze that dominated the start of the 2000s and how during Christmas you would have variations like the mini Santa cheesecake. A bite-sized snack, this made use of strawberries and other ingredients to represent Santa's colors, giving it a lovely visual as well as a fantastic taste. I guess it was more common for something like this to come out of New York than anywhere else, really. It was one of the hot spots for the entire focus on miniature desserts even back when these things first started. And it stayed as a cultural main point, where all things that affect the country definitely pass by New York. Taste of Home's Christmas Baking Cookbook highlighted this recipe as a fond Christmas favorite, one that really got all the kids together at the table. Speaking of what went on during the start of the 2000s, I'd feel pretty criminal if I didn't include it in roast pumpkin salad. You've already seen some salads on the list so far that push the boundaries of what a salad conventionally is. You and I are probably used to seeing Caesar salads and lots of greens on the plate whenever somebody mentions one, so for things like roasted pumpkin to make an entrance, it took a bit of getting used to. However, that doesn't at all mean it wasn't welcome, since people took to roast pumpkins insanely well. California, especially, had a whole pumpkin salad subculture going on, and the dish started becoming more and more popular outside of the holidays, too. It was a perfect fall or winter dish since it used other warm ingredients like spinach, arugula, and goat cheese. Plus, a lot of Americans were vouching for healthier food anyway, so this fit everything the nation was asking for at the time. Fruit mince pies are probably the one dish that has the oldest roots on this entire list. If we want to get really technical about it, then it was made in the 17th century, but it only really picked steam around the 19th century when it decided to let go of meat entirely and instead focused on alcohol and fruit. This was kind of a trend that started only in the 20th century, since earlier versions of the mince pie always meant that you were having a hefty serving of meat to go with it too. However, thanks to the Depression and the World War era, people became a lot more used to eating seasonal fruit and making dishes out of that instead. Meat would rise in price and become pretty unaffordable, especially anything that wasn't chicken. Poultry or red meat was out of the question for most people. Since the dish had some pretty strong European and British ties, it was most popular in places like New England. It then became a part of booze food in American culture around the 20th century, where it was a staple of Christmas parties even outside of European communities that had heavy British-American populations. People couldn't get enough of all the different versions of a fruit mince pie you could get out there. Wanted something with raisins? You were covered. Candied apples or citrus peels? A bakery around the corner does an amazing one. Prefer brandy over rum? Most places had the option for both. When I say they caught on, I mean they spread, like pretty severely. Another much more recent Christmas tradition was chocolate mint slice Christmas balls. These actually came over from Australia, and that's a bit of a surprise since we don't have a big focus on Australian food here. Even when we were importing culture and food from other countries, nobody really looked at Australia and thought, yeah, I need whatever they're on. Anyway, that was different for these Christmas balls because they were some of the first instances of chocolate mint actually gaining a fan base in the States. Mint was something we only really associated with Christmas back then, so it made sense that this dish found a foothold in holiday season cooking. Plus, it also fit the culture of no-fuss recipes that was going on throughout the 20th century. I think after all that rationing and budgeting, people just got used to simple dishes that did one thing pretty well instead of flashy ones with 4 different flavors and themes going on. Something you can rely on is always best, you know? Plus, for most people, it was really easy to make, and it made for one hell of a gift basket, so people adopted this dainty dish into their regular holiday repertoire. Getting a basket full of these mint-flavored balls covered in this dark, melted chocolate was amazing. Americans took it a step further and crushed cookies to make a base for the dough of the balls. It usually contained cookies like Oreos, too. All in all, this was definitely one for people with a massive sweet tooth and for people who don't give in at the tiniest sugar rush. Pavlova rolls are also something you could consider a pretty new concept in retrospect. There wasn't really much of a demand for them until the 60s after the war, when America first started to explore foreign cuisines and experiment with desserts from different parts of the world. Pavlovas are a delicate meringue-based dessert, typically topped with fruits and whipped cream, but the roll version makes use of a jelly-style roll. This variation not only retains the lightness and sweetness of the original, but also offers more portability, making it easier to eat on the go. You know, we probably don't think about this stuff often, but those little details like whether you can walk around while eating play a huge role in shaping the popularity and practicality of a dish. Accessibility is key in the food world, and Pavlova rolls exemplify that principle quite well. The combination of sweet meringue and fruity jelly layers offers a delightful contrast, which may have contributed to their brief moment of fame. However, they didn't seem to do well past the late 90s, possibly because the popularity of jelly-style rolls declined and consumer preferences shifted towards more modern or health-conscious desserts. Trends in the food industry are unpredictable, and even the most well-loved treats can fade out when new ideas or health trends emerge. Christmas salads really set the mood for the whole holiday. Few things are as good at establishing that a holiday feels like a good gelatin salad that everyone can pass around, regardless of age or tastes. The salad haters get to enjoy a bowl, the salad lovers are at the edge of their seats, usually asking for seconds, and the home chefs love making a new dish that actually expands their imagination a bit. Snow salads were kind of a sweet spot for everyone because they also had whipped cream and marshmallows involved. There was fruit too, but the emphasis was on the whipped cream. These were also really pretty-looking salads. They had a pastel color that made them really attractive for anybody to have at the table. American holidays wouldn't be complete without these back in the 60s, and potlucks wouldn't be either. Most cookbooks, like the Joys of Jello or Junior League collections, also included recipes that involved several different variations of snow salads, which were not only very in theme with the season, but also something that just became so ingrained into Christmas tradition that people couldn't imagine a holiday without them. Christmas morning coffee cake was another way to really break in the festive spirit. You would wake up, shovel snow, come back in, and enjoy your morning with some coffee cake. America's probably one of the few countries on the planet with a die-hard fan base for coffee-flavored desserts, as the rest of the world chooses to sleep on this phenomenal combination of coffee notes with famous desserts. Not our cookbooks, though. From Betty Crocker cookbooks to the ones targeted right at your grandparents like the Taste of Home ones, everyone would recommend you start that Christmas right with a morning coffee cake. You could say it really picked up after the 50s, but I would say it peaked around the 2000s. Coffee cakes are already a staple for breakfast or brunch, so when they became a staple for holidays too, it kind of cemented them as one of the most American things you could experience. Really a part of the culture. And I would rather not imagine a country where bakeries don't serve you coffee cake when the temperature drops. Of course, no Christmas dessert that you would associate with home cooking, whether it's your grandma's or your mom's, would be complete without a cranberry-based banger. Hot cranberry bakes were just that, and they were this really sweet, tangy baked cranberry masterpiece that would get mixed with dried nuts or sometimes even oats. Most home chefs at the time would top it off with breadcrumbs that would give an awesome crunch when baked, and the cranberry filling was just to die for. The entire cranberry craze would start every year around the fall, when harvests really peak and suppliers are loaded with fresh stock. This dish had its heyday in the falls after the 1960s, when it caught on as the perfect holiday dessert to make for the family, especially in places like New England. It was different from other food at the time in that it was probably one of the last examples of purely seasonal cooking. You couldn't make this at the wrong times of the year. Molasses? Where would America be without them? Probably in the farms trying to get one more potato than last year. Molasses have been the savior to hunger aches and pains ever since the 17th century, and that definitely continued with the introduction of dishes like Molasses Crinkles. So some people think that this is an offshoot of molasses cookies, which were really popular in early American baking. They would usually use spices like cinnamon and nutmeg in the cookie recipes, and these were a lot less refined than the cookies we're used to seeing today. They definitely did get the job done though, and their simplicity meant that they could be made in batches easily. The crinkle cookie takes after its predecessor a lot. It's still simple to make, but it uses baking powder and soda now because back then it just wasn't as easily available, so a lot of recipes omit it from the preparation. The crinkle that gives the dish its namesake wouldn't have been possible without these two ingredients, and the cookie became a fan favorite of cookie heads all over America. The cookie batter was also something that home chefs and their kids loved eating, but don't let anyone tell you about that. It was great that they came back around the 50s when America was still reeling from the effects of a horrible recession and 2 world wars, and the populace needed easy, accessible food more than ever. Even Betty Crocker put a great word out for these cookies, and once again, molasses became a key part of the culture of the era. No-bake treats were a lifesaver for busy families, and chocolate haystacks were a favorite. These little no-bake goodies were made with chow mein noodles and melted chocolate. Yep, you heard that right. These cookies are a product of the make do with what you have era. The crunchy noodles gave this dessert a unique texture that made it stand out from the rest. They were incredibly easy to make. Just melt the chocolate, mix in the noodles, and drop spoonfuls onto a baking sheet to set. The kids loved this one in the 90s, and they were a hit at parties and school events. These ones really need to make a grand re-entry, don't they? Okay, so this next dessert's reputation speaks for itself. I'm talking about Snickerdoodle Cookies. This bad boy was timeless. You could be 5 or you could be 45 and still enjoy the soft, chewy Snickerdoodles coated in cinnamon sugar, which gave them a sweet, slightly spicy flavor. And trust me, it was impossible to resist. Snickerdoodles are considered a classic American cookie, with a history that dates back to the late 1800s. 2 centuries later, they're still a fan favorite. Now, you could get these at many popular bakeries, but nothing beats what Granny whipped up in minutes back in the day. This biscuit was the star of Grandma's cookie jar, and always the first one to disappear. Now, not all of us had a sweet tooth growing up, but you know grandmas, they had something for everyone. And lemon meringue pie was the dessert of our dreams. It wasn't too sugary, just the right balance of tart and sweet. The pie that we knew growing up was believed to have evolved from 2 earlier desserts, the lemon custard pie and meringue-topped desserts. The lemon meringue pie consisted of a shortened pastry base filled with lemon curd and topped with meringue. This dessert became all the rage during the Victorian era, which made it one of the luxury dessert options of the time. But you know how our grandmas loved spoiling us, and she was always ready to whip up labor-intensive meals as long as they brought a smile to our faces. Plus, this one was also one of the healthier desserts. Yeah, thanks to the lemon's vitamin C and the absence of heavy creams and custard. It doesn't really get better than this, does it? Rocky Mountain Chocolate Fudge is one of the sweetest scoops of ice cream you might try. This delectable, rich, and creamy chocolate fudge owes its success to Rocky Mountain Chocolate, which is an international brand that makes some of Colorado's finest Rocky Mountain tubs. You'll find outlets everywhere, but the best ice cream has to be where the company's based in Durango. This has been a favorite of children across every state, and if you're visiting as a tourist, you need to grab yourself some. If you love a good brownie, you would love the chocolate cream cheese brownies, which took everyone's favorite treat to the next level. Imagine rich, fudgy chocolate brownie batter swirled with creamy cheesecake filling. The origin of these brownies is somewhat disputed, but most culinary historians agree that brownies were first created in the United States in the late 19th century. This 2-in-1 dessert was a staple at bake sales, parties, or even a simple treat at home. You know those days when you can't decide between a brownie or a cheesecake? Well, the chocolate cream cheese brownie was your answer. Some variations include adding additional flavors like raspberry, pumpkin, or caramel to the cream cheese layer. Others contain different types of chocolate, such as white chocolate or dark chocolate. So why did this one leave us so soon? Some things are just not meant to stay forever, and the chocolate cream cheese brownie was one of them. If you grew up in the South, I'm sure you're familiar with the Hummingbird Cake. Yeah, it'd be a crime if this one didn't strike a chord. So this was pretty much a good old cake with exciting tropical flavors of banana, pineapple, and pecans. Let's be honest, we all get a little bored of chocolatey desserts from time to time, so this one was a good break from the classics. NS. The cake's origins can be traced back to Jamaica, where it was originally known as the Dr. Bird Cake. The name Hummingbird Cake came from the idea that the cake was so sweet and delicious that it would attract hummingbirds. I don't know about hummingbirds, but it had all my attention for sure. I remember begging Granny for this one. This one was a famous choice for weddings, and Grandma's involvement made it extra special for the big day. Possum Pie is an Arkansas favorite, a layered dessert with chocolate pudding, cream cheese, and whipped cream. As good as it sounds, the story of how it made its claim to fame is just as much of a delight. In a 1974 newspaper, this pie swept the competition, and it wouldn't stop making headlines after either. In the Arkansas Gazette, a dish called Possum Pie randomly popped up and got a review in around the 1980s. Imagine stumbling upon a pie so good, the rest of your city can't shut up about it either. Summer just wasn't complete without Grandma's irresistible strawberry shortcake. So, this one was a popular choice for picnics, barbecues, and family gatherings during the warmer months, and Grandma was always responsible for it. And just like everything else on the list, she made it absolutely delicious. Many grandmas took pride in making homemade whipped cream, and it's exactly what made it stand out from the rest of the desserts on the table in terms of taste. But hey, this one didn't just taste good. It looked appetizing too, making it the perfect dessert to take to potlucks. Strawberry shortcake is particularly associated with the strawberry season, which typically runs from late spring to early summer. A trip to the farmer's market during strawberry season pretty much meant you were going to have some strawberry shortcakes for dessert. Nowadays, people usually go for strawberry cheesecake, but if you were lucky enough to taste this one back in the day, you know the shortcake didn't just come to play. If you thought beat in a cake was bizarre, wait till you hear about the chocolate zucchini cake. This cake was a popular way to use up the extra summer squash. This treat originated in the mid-20th century in Florida and made waves around the world. So how did we even reach the point of adding zucchini to the cake? Well, the story starts with a bored garden owner with chocolate cake batter and a whole lot of zucchini. You know what happens when people get bored? You mix everything in sight, and this accident resulted in a dessert that made our childhoods memorable. It was a staple in cookbooks in the 1980s, but slowly started to fade away in the 2000s. You can't find this one in bakeries, but hey, it's never too late to dust off your grandma's cookbooks, is it? Well, rice pudding is also one that wasn't just delicious, but also healthy. Don't you love it when sweet treats come with health benefits? Talk about a good deal. So, I'm sure I don't need to get into the nitty-gritty of this one because who doesn't remember the taste of rice pudding? It started out as a way to use up leftover rice and soon became the dessert that had everyone coming back for seconds. Not only this, but rice pudding was one of the easiest desserts to make and was made with ingredients easily found around the house like rice, milk, and sugar. Rice pudding originated in Europe and was brought to the States by European immigrants. Our grandmas decide to take the classic dessert up a notch by adding some key ingredients like vanilla, nutmeg, maple syrup, or cinnamon. Now, with the change in tastes and trends, this one never made it to big restaurants, but let's be honest, Grandma made it better than any Michelin star chef could possibly have. It's something about making sweet treats with a whole lot less sugar and a whole lot more love. Prickly Pear Sorbets, a refreshing sorbet made from prickly pear cactus fruit. These cactuses exclusively grow in South America and have long been a proud staple of Southern and, in particular, Mexican culture. They even have it on their flag, and for good reason. If you tried this, you'd be just as crazy about it. It's a fruit sorbet with just the right amounts of tropical goodness and sweetness. Okay, so this next one was a staple on Grandma's dinner table during the holidays. Yeah, I'm talking about the spice cake. Come on, there's no way you don't remember this bad boy. Spice cake had been a beloved dessert for centuries, with origins tracing back to medieval Europe. The use of spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves in cakes became popular during the 18th and 19th centuries after these ingredients were brought to America. Someone's grandma decided to add spices to an old-fashioned cake batter, and let's just say we're extremely grateful for it. This cake shaped many childhoods as its aroma marked the start of fall and holiday season. From Thanksgiving days to Christmas mornings, this one was always sitting in the kitchen for anyone who wanted a taste of the season. The chocolate sauerkraut cake was a showstopper back in the day. Now, I know what you're thinking. Sauerkraut in a cake? I've got to be kidding, right? Well, don't knock it till you try it. The sauerkraut added moisture and a slight tang to the cake, which balanced out the sweetness of the chocolate. Plus, once baked, the sauerkraut became almost undetectable, leaving behind the chocolate cake of our dreams. The big question remains, who decided to put sauerkraut in chocolate cake? The year was 1965, and bakers decided to make a cake that kept everyone guessing. No one could figure out the secret ingredient that gave this cake its tanginess. The Depression era was all about adding whatever you could find to your chocolate cakes. This dessert died down because this weird combination didn't sit right with people as the world kept progressing. But hey, if you ever dare to try this one, you're welcome. Many great things have come out of Alaska, but nothing beats the baked Alaska grandma would bring home on the weekends. If it doesn't ring a bell, let me jog up your memory really quickly. This dessert was made of ice cream placed in a pie dish, lined with slices of sponge cake or Christmas pudding, and topped with meringue. Now, don't let the name fool you. This delicacy didn't really originate in Alaska. Yeah, it was made at the famous Delmonico's restaurant in New York City. The dessert was supposedly named Alaska, Florida, in 1867 to celebrate the United States' purchase of Alaska from Russia, with the cold ice cream representing Alaska and the warm, baked meringue representing the sunny state of Florida. This one is known for its dramatic presentation. It was brought to the table aflame with a flambe. Many grandmas love to make baked Alaska for special occasions because of its wow factor. A rolled chocolate sponge cake filled with cream. What's not to love? The chocolate roll was a fan favorite all the way from Europe, also known as the Swiss roll. This delicious treat was a thin sponge cake filled with icing, whipped cream, jam, or pretty much any filling you can possibly imagine. The chocolate roll was considered a sophisticated dessert, which made it perfect for fancy tea parties. There was a different version of this in almost every country you can name, and Japan even filled it with fruits like strawberries sometimes. It was a fan favorite. However, as other easier-to-make desserts gained popularity, the chocolate roll began to fade away. But those who remember it still hold a special place in their hearts for this chocolatey goodness. The Mississippi mud pie was a chocolate lover's dream, rich, gooey, and full of fudge. This wasn't your grandma's good old pecan pie. This delicious treat featured a chocolate crust and a fudgy filling and was often topped with whipped cream or even more chocolate. But the graham cracker crust was definitely the star of the show. As the name suggests, this cake was created in Mississippi as a variant of the plain mud cake. Some different versions also include marshmallows, pecans, walnuts, pudding, or even liquor. It made all the buzz in the 1980s and was a hit at the kids' table. So why did it vanish from our tables? Well, as lighter desserts became more popular, the Mississippi mud pie became nothing more than a part of history. Next up, we gave the rhubarb pie. This is another one of Grandma's treats that wasn't too sweet or heavy on the stomach. It was a springtime hit made with fresh rhubarb sugar and often a touch of cinnamon or nutmeg. Rhubarb grows abundantly in gardens, and this recipe was the perfect way to use it up and celebrate the flavors of the season. Remember when we'd wait all year long for spring to come just for a slice of this one? Well, some grandmas canned or froze the rhubarb to use throughout the year. Rhubarb is naturally quite tart and can be too sour to eat raw. In pies, it was typically paired with sugar to create a more palatable and balanced flavor. Grandmas often experimented with different amounts of sugar and other ingredients like strawberries to complement the tartness of rhubarb. Lane cake gets its name from Emma Rylander, who struck gold with this white sponge cake because it became a staple of Alabama's diet. That's where it gets its name from too, and its secret kick, the whiskey, was a fan favorite all across the state. She showed up one day with this cake to a county fair in Clayton, Alabama, won first prize, and the rest, as they say, is history. Did you know it was also once the official cake of Alabama? You can't possibly have a conversation about forgotten grandma desserts and not bring up the infamous Blackberry Cobbler. This one was a summer favorite when blackberries were in season and at their peak of flavor. So, cobblers have their roots in early American history. Pioneers who traveled across the country had to make do with what they had, and traditional pies were difficult to bake on the road. Instead, they would cover the fruit with a layer of biscuit dough or batter and cook it in a Dutch oven, creating what we now know as a cobbler. The blackberries didn't only give the cobbler some flavor, but also packed it with antioxidants. This dessert was particularly famous in southern states and was a staple at many southern family gatherings, church picnics, and barbecues. Let's have a full circle moment by making our way back to another apple dessert. I'm talking about the apple pandowdy. This was a variation of the classic apple pie. The name pandowdy comes from an old-fashioned word dowdy, which means shabby or unkempt. This referred to the pie's rustic appearance, where the crust often fell apart and the filling spilled over. Grandmas have been passing down recipes for this one since the 19th century, but somehow it is finally getting lost in the shuffle of modern recipes. Okay, so last but certainly not the least, we have Brown Betty. Does anyone remember this one? It was pretty much a baked fruit pudding that combined layers of spiced fruit and buttered breadcrumbs or crumbled bread. The most common version of Brown Betty used apples, but the recipe also included other fruits like pears or berries, depending on whatever was in season. The best part? Each grandma had their own way of making this one true to themselves, whether it was a secret blend of spices or a unique fruit combo. The Black Forest cake is a German masterpiece with layers of chocolate cake, tart cherries, whipped cream, and a healthy dose of Kirsch, cherry brandy for adults. This cake was a true showstopper at family gatherings, but it took more time than your average chocolate cake to make. The Germans don't come to play with their recipes. The star of the show has to be the alcoholic spirit that made the cherries sour, giving the cake its signature taste. Other spirits were also sometimes used, such as rum, which was common in Austrian recipes. Well, all good things come to an end, and so did his decadent dessert that has fallen out of favor, possibly because it takes a bit of effort to make. But if you ever get the chance to try it, you'll understand why it ever made it to our list. Speaking of nostalgia, nothing brings back childhood memories of visiting Grams quite like some old-fashioned bread pudding. Every time there was stale bread on the counter, we knew Grandma was going to make some delicious bread pudding. This dessert became known as poor man's pudding because it was affordable. The best part about this one? You could add your own twist with toppings like raisins, chocolate chips, nuts, or fruit. While Grandma's bread pudding might have a classic American twist, this dish had international cousins. In France, it was known as pain perdu, which meant lost bread. In the UK, it was sometimes called bread and butter pudding. And in Mexico, there was a version called capirotada, which was traditionally eaten during Lent. Sadly, we're in the era of croissants and pastries, and this simple sweet treat can't compete with the fancies. Still, if you've got some bread, milk, and sugar at home, there's no better or easier way to use up the leftovers. Dust off your grandma's old cookbooks, and you might just find her exact secret recipe. So, blondies are the butterscotch-flavored cousins of brownies and are also often called blonde brownies. Surprisingly, blondies actually predate brownies. Recipes for molasses-flavored bar cookies, which are considered early versions of blondies, appeared in cookbooks as far back as the late 19th century, before the more famous chocolate brownie took the spotlight. Grandmas often baked these when they wanted a break from chocolate treats. While brownies may have overshadowed blondies for a while, blondies have been making a comeback in recent years. They've become a trendy dessert at cafes and bakeries, where they're often topped off with gourmet ingredients like toffee bits, browned butter, or even matcha. Apple cider donuts took Connecticut by storm. At first, just spiced donuts made with fresh apple cider. It turned into something incredible when Harlem baker Adolph Levitt and a bright-eyed engineer met by chance. They got to making a system that could cut the work of making donuts in less than a half time, making apple cider donuts a marvel in the 1970s. Ever thought of putting mayonnaise on a cake? Well, back in the day, chocolate mayonnaise cake was all the rage. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, hear me out. This cake came into existence when Mrs. Paul, the wife of a Hellmann's sales distributor, used Hellmann's mayonnaise instead of butter for her cake batter. Well, this cake is proof that accidents sometimes lead to beautiful or delicious things. Yep, it melts right into your mouth, thanks to an incredibly moist sponge. There were two famous versions of this mayo cake floating around. The first and older recipe was a chocolate cake with raisins and dates, and the other was just a regular two-layer chocolate cake with whatever frosting you like. This chocolatey goodness slipped away because adding mayonnaise to a cake started sounding a tad bit too bizarre. If you've got a jar of mayo lying around, you know what to whip up. Trust me, you won't taste a hint of mayonnaise in there. Everything's bigger in Texas, and that includes their sheet cake. The Texas sheet cake was a large, thin chocolate cake topped with a poured chocolate icing. It was perfect for feeding a crowd back when the wallets were a bit tighter for most folks. The cake was incredibly moist and rich, and the icing was often made with cocoa, butter, and pecans, which made it easy to whip out in a short amount of time. Think fudgy brownies in cake form? The craziest part? This used to be a staple at funerals. This treat was also a hit at churches, which gave it the name of church lady cake. Now, it was mostly a crowd pleaser, but you can have it all for yourself too. We don't judge here. Since more sophisticated desserts like cinnamon rolls and tiramisu entered the chat, The Texas sheet cake couldn't keep up and faded away. Let's start the video with everyone's favorite peach cobbler. Whether made with fresh, juicy peaches at the height of summer or canned peaches during the off-season, this dessert never failed to bring warmth to the table. Grandmas have always been great at making those labor-intensive meals, but this one was a laid-back treat that they whipped up in minutes. Yeah, even you can make it. Just take a few peaches, toss them with sugar and spices, and top with dollops of biscuit dough. This one was served best with a side of vanilla ice cream. Some grandmas even added a splash of bourbon to make the cobbler extra special. Plus, this dessert became so popular that there is even a day dedicated to it. April 13th is National Peach Cobbler Day in the United States, so mark your calendars and call your grandmas for some childhood nostalgia. The chocolate icebox cake screams nostalgia like no other. This dessert was a staple for many families, especially during the hot summer months when turning on the oven was not an option. We're talking about layers of chocolate wafers and whipped cream stacked and chilled in the fridge. But the true magic happened when you let it sit in the icebox overnight. That's where the name comes from. The wafers absorbed the moisture from the cream, which almost gave it a cake-like texture without any baking. This one was a hit across the globe. Australia, Philippines, United Kingdom, America, you name it. Sadly, this one just went out of style, but I think the weather has really been calling for this one to make a comeback. Don't you think? Potatoes in a cake? Believe it or not, chocolate potato cake was a thing, and it was delicious. The mashed potatoes added incredible moisture and texture to the cake, which made it wonderfully soft and rich. And before you start wondering, no, the potatoes didn't affect the taste, they just made the cake better. The chocolate potato cake first came into existence in the 1930s and became famous in parts of the United States and Ireland. This was a popular dessert in times when people had to make do with what they had, and it became an instant hit. Potatoes were common, cheap, and available at all times. It was a great way to use leftover mashed potatoes or sneak some veggies into a dessert. As long as you don't tell the kids, if you're ever bored and craving a crazy treat, you know what to make. So, chocolate chiffon cake was a real classic back in the day. What made it so special? This cake was the ultimate two-in-one hybrid with the fluffiness of a sponge cake with the richness of chocolate. The secret to its light texture was beaten egg whites, which were gently folded into the batter. This cake was perfect for days when you wanted a chocolate treat without feeling too full. The best part? The powdered sugar topping that made the cake melt like fluffy clouds in your mouth. This delicious treat originated in California, and the recipe was kept a secret for 20 years until Harry Baker finally sold it and published it for the public in a Betty Crocker pamphlet in 1948. Unfortunately, as other cakes became more popular, everyone just kind of forgot about the delicious chiffon cake. Peach ice cream is one of the few reasons to have an extended stay in Delaware. Homemade ice cream made with fresh peaches. Though ice cream freezers make this job a lot easier than it used to be, back in the days of lettuce brine, you had to do it all by hand. Manually mixing the ice cream did take 10 times longer, but it also led to some incredibly vivid and flavorful ice cream, the kind Delaware would eventually become known for across every state. I think it's fair to say that apples were a crucial part of whipping up desserts back in the day. But hey, apple pie wasn't the only sweet treat we got out of this fruit. Remember Grandma's apple dumplings? These were made by wrapping a whole or sliced apple in dough and then baking it until golden brown. And Grandma's apple syrup topping was like cherry on top. This was a labor-intensive dessert, which is pretty much why it's associated with Grandma's kitchen. The process of peeling, coring, and stuffing the apples and then carefully wrapping them in dough was a true labor of love. This one was commonly enjoyed as a dessert, but no one judged you if you ate it as breakfast. I mean, pair it with a cup of coffee and your taste buds will thank you. Speaking of tough times, the chocolate depression cake was one of the best inventions of the Depression era. So, what makes this one so special? Well, you can bake this one without any eggs, milk, or butter. I'm all ears. Despite its humble beginnings, this cake was a delicious treat that was not only tasty, but also budget-friendly. Name a better combo, I'll wait. This cake was also called the poor man's cake, and a fancier version had raisins as toppings. It has been declared to be the most worthwhile cake ever made. The Depression era is gone, and so is the chocolate depression cake. This cake was a great example of great things being born in tough times. You and I both know this list would be incomplete without the mention of classic Whoopi pies. Now, these come with an interesting origin story. Whoopi pies are believed to have originated in the northeastern United States, particularly in Pennsylvania Dutch country, or Maine. According to legend, when Amish women would bake these treats, their husbands or children would exclaim, "Whoopi!" upon finding them in their lunch pails. And let's be honest, we all did that little whoopee when we sighted this one in our grandma's fridge. So these were a perfect cross between a cake and a cookie. But despite their name, they were more like mini cakes than actual pies. These were the best on-the-go treats that you could just grab on your way out. Also, here's a fun fact. In 2011, the Whoopi Pie was named the official state treat of Maine. Chocolate beet cake was another creative way to sneak veggies and add a bit of nutrition to a chocolate cake. Beets added natural sweetness and moisture, creating a dense and flavorful cake. And don't even get me started on the beautiful red hue it added to the batter. The history of chocolate beet cake is often linked to wartime periods, particularly World War II, when food rationing was common. Yep, this cake came all the way from Europe and was very popular around the time when beetroot was abundant. This cake is proof that cake can be healthy too. All you need to do is add beet to it. Now, this cake began to disappear as soon as people caught on to the secret vegetable in it. Yeah, the taste must be delicious, but chocolate and beet don't really sound appetizing together, do they? However, this one survived the war, and that has got to mean something. We shouldn't let it slip by this easily. We've got all sorts of fancy pies nowadays, from chocolate hazelnut mousse to blackberry merlot, but Grandma's banana cream pie was the talk of the town in the 60s. Do you remember coming home to a chilly slice of this delicacy? This one was a guaranteed crowd pleaser, and that's why it was the star of the table during the holidays. Here's the thing. Bananas were very readily available in the US in the 1950s till 1960s, which means people had to come up with creative ways of eating them. And well, grandmas know best, especially when it comes to hearty desserts. The post-World War II era saw a boom in convenience foods and desserts that were easy to make at home, and banana cream pie fit perfectly into this trend. This wasn't just your favorite dessert. It was reportedly a favorite of President Harry S. Truman, who had a sweet tooth for simple, homey desserts. There was also a no-bake version of the banana cream pie, perfect for summer days when turning on the oven wasn't ideal. The black bottom pie takes the cake for being one of the most fanciest desserts on the list. I'm sure you remember this one. This pie is made of a chocolate custard base with a graham cracker crust topped with a layer of vanilla cream. Sounds pretty classic, right? But trust me, this one's even better than it sounds. The bottom in the name refers to the chocolate that sinks during baking. Black bottom pie is of southern origin, with the black bottom representing the dark, swampy lowlands along the Mississippi River. It became a hit in Thanksgiving dinners during the early 1940s in Oklahoma City. This pie may have disappeared from our dinner tables, but it will always have a deep place in our hearts. I say we sign a petition to bring this one back. Since we're on the topic of pies, cherry pie was another one of Grandma's culinary masterpieces. This was the kind of dessert that made any bad day 10 times better with just one bite. Traditionally, cherry pie was made with sour cherries rather than sweet cherries. Morello cherries were one of the most common kinds of cherry used, but other varieties such as the black cherry were also popular. So, cherry pie is considered one of the most iconic pies in America, second to only apple pie. There's a famous story about young George Washington chopping down a cherry tree and then confessing to it, saying, "I cannot tell a lie." Legend says this cemented the importance of cherry in American history and inspired our grandmas to add the fruit to their delicious desserts and meals. Cherry salad was another popular dessert back in the day. Californian raisin cookies, soft cookies filled with sweet raisins. They got pretty popular due to an ad agency called Foot, Cone, and Belding, which ran a commercial at the time which helped these cookies gain a lot of momentum. Since then, they've become a part of California culture, and any local will delightfully tell you childhood memories of them. Coconut became a popular ingredient in the US during the late 1800s, and coconut cream pie instantly became a cult classic. This one was really different than Grandma's usual desserts as it brought a taste of topics to the table. The heart of this pastry was the coconut cream filling made with coconut milk or cream, sugar, eggs, and sometimes a bit of cornstarch to thicken. And no coconut pie was complete without a thick layer of whipped cream on top. Thankfully, my grandma was extra generous with the topping. Some grandmas liked putting their own spin on the dessert by adding a hint of vanilla or almond extract to the filling, or even pineapple for a piña colada-inspired twist. Sadly, today's store-bought versions don't even come close to what Gram used to make back in the day. Do you remember going to the pumpkin patch with your grandparents back in the day? Well, my favorite part about those trips was the pumpkin pie Gram used to whip up afterward. This one was a seasonal favorite and the star of the dessert table at Thanksgiving. Now, this wasn't all the hype amongst kids, but the adults could never have enough of it. During the Great Depression, frozen pumpkin pie became popular because it was a practical way to preserve the harvest and provide a delicious treat throughout the year. But nothing beats a warm slice fresh from Grandma's oven. Did we ring any bells with you with these dishes, or just jingle bells that make you miss Christmas? Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.